Yorkshire, October 1818. The storm arrived without warning, as autumn tempests often did in the northern counties, transforming an already treacherous road into a river of mud and stone. Inside the swaying carriage, Genevieve Clara Aldridge, Countess of Brackley, gripped the leather strap with white-knuckled hands and questioned the wisdom of this journey. She had left London 3 days prior, leaving behind only a brief note for her husband. Not an explanation, precisely, but an acknowledgement that she needed time away from Brackley Manor, away from the suffocating silence that had become their marriage. The carriage lurched violently, and through the rain-streaked window, she caught a glimpse of Thomas Waverley, their loyal coachman of 15 years, struggling to control the terrified horses. Then the world turned sideways. Metal screamed against rock, wood splintered like kindling, and Genevieve's last conscious thought was a peculiar sense of relief that at least, in this moment, she felt something other than the hollow numbness that had consumed her for 3 years. If stories of love lost and found again, of memories stolen and hearts reclaimed, move your soul, I would be deeply grateful for a like or subscribe. Your support helps me continue bringing you tales of redemption and second chances in the most unexpected places. 6 days after the accident, in the drawing room of their London townhouse on Berkeley Square, Gideon Marlowe Aldridge, Earl of Brackley, stood before the fireplace and stared at the letter that had just been delivered by express rider. His hands trembled as he read the words a third time, as if repetition might change their meaning. The carriage had been found overturned in a ravine near the village of Thornwick in Yorkshire. Thomas Waverley's body had been discovered 50 yards from the wreckage, his neck broken in the fall. But of the Countess of Brackley, there was no trace. No body, no belongings, nothing but a single glove caught in the splintered doorframe. "My lord," his butler Henderson spoke quietly from the doorway. "Shall I send word to the magistrate?" Gideon's jaw tightened. He was a tall man, lean and hardened from 6 years of military service in the peninsula, with dark hair streaked with silver and gray eyes that seemed perpetually winter cold. Those who remembered him from before the wars said he had returned a different man, one who kept the world at arm's length, with carefully maintained courtesy that never quite became warmth. "No," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion had he still possessed the capacity for such displays. "I shall go myself, immediately." Henderson's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of his surprise. "My lord, surely it would be more appropriate to send your steward, or perhaps your man of business. The investigation could take weeks." Gideon folded the letter with precise movements, as if controlling the paper might help him control the chaos rising in his chest. "My wife is missing, Henderson, possibly dead. I will not delegate this to subordinates." As the butler withdrew to make preparations, Gideon moved to the window overlooking Berkeley Square. Rain streaked the glass, much as it must have done in Yorkshire 6 days ago. 6 days during which Genevieve had been missing, possibly injured, possibly worse, and he had been here in London, completely unaware. He attended to correspondence, reviewed accounts, and carried on with his orderly existence while his wife had been erased from the world. The guilt settled over him like a familiar coat. He had married Genevieve Clara Harrington because it had been expected, because both families had arranged it, because at 31 years of age and with an earldom to maintain, he needed an heir. She had been 23, gentle, cultured, with soft brown hair and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. She had smiled during their wedding ceremony, and he registered absolutely nothing. That numbness, he knew now, had been his greatest sin. Not cruelty, which would at least have provoked a response, but indifference dressed up as courtesy. He provided for her every material need, treated her with perfect propriety, and kept her at precisely the distance necessary to prevent any genuine connection. He greeted her mornings with the newspaper already raised, ate dinners in near silence, and spent evenings in separate rooms as she read alone in the library while he worked in his study. He had told himself it was enough. That marriage was a duty fulfilled, not a source of happiness. that the emptiness inside him, carved out by too many battles and too many dead friends, was simply the price of survival. Now, staring at the rain, he wondered if Genevieve had been trying to tell him something with that brief note she had left. Not an explanation she had written, but she needed time away. From Brackley Manor. From him. Had she been running from their marriage when the accident occurred? The thought struck his chest with the force of a blow, unexpected in its intensity. He had spent 3 years ensuring he felt nothing, and now Providence seemed determined to make him feel everything at once. "My lord," Henderson returned, "the traveling coach will be ready within the hour. I have taken the liberty of packing your essentials and sending word to the stables to prepare fresh horses at each posting inn along the northern route." Gideon nodded, still staring out at the rain. Somewhere in Yorkshire, his wife was missing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that perhaps he had lost her long before any carriage accident. He turned from the window with military precision, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral. "Thank you, Henderson. I shall depart as soon as the preparations are complete." As the butler withdrew again, Gideon allowed himself one moment of unguarded emotion. His hand pressed flat against the cool glass of the window, and he closed his eyes. "Genevieve," he whispered to the empty room, "please be alive. Please give me the chance to do better." It was not a request, but a vow, the first one he had uttered since returning from the wars. The journey north took 3 days of hard travel, changing horses at every opportunity, barely stopping to rest. Gideon arrived in Thornwick on a gray afternoon that carried the same heavy silence as his mood. The village clustered around a church and a single inn called the Shepherd's Rest. The local magistrate, a portly man named Edmund Hartwell, met him in the inn's private parlor with the efficient sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news before. "Lord Brackley," Hartwell began, setting a leather satchel on the table between them. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. We have conducted a thorough search of the ravine and surrounding area. The coachman, as you know, was found deceased. But as for the Countess, I regret to say we have found no trace." "Show me where it happened," Gideon demanded, bypassing pleasantries. Hartwell hesitated. "My lord, the sight is quite disturbing. The violence of the accident was considerable. Perhaps it would be better to remember the Countess as she was." "I am a veteran of Badajoz and Waterloo, Mr. Hartwell. I have seen violence. Show me the site." 2 hours later, Gideon stood at the edge of the ravine, staring down at the splintered remains of his family's carriage. The rain had washed away much of the evidence, but the deep gouges in the muddy slope told the story clearly enough. The carriage had left the road during the storm, tumbled down the steep embankment, and shattered against the rocks at the bottom. "We found the coachman there," Hartwell pointed to a spot near a large boulder. "The horses had broken free and were discovered 3 miles away by a farmer, but the Countess, as I said, has simply vanished." "She could have survived the fall," Gideon said, more to himself than to the magistrate. "If she was thrown clear during the initial tumble, before the carriage struck the rocks, she could have walked away, disoriented, injured." "We considered that possibility, my lord. Every household in Thornwick and the surrounding area has been questioned. No one has seen a woman matching the Countess's description." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Then your search was inadequate. She is somewhere. People do not simply disappear." Over the following days, Gideon conducted his own investigation with the methodical thoroughness he had once applied to military campaigns. He visited every cottage, every farm, every shepherd's hut within a 10-mile radius. He offered rewards, questioned travelers, examined every scrap of evidence Hartwell's men had collected. Nothing. It was as if Genevieve had been erased from existence in that moment of impact, leaving behind only questions and a growing, aching absence that Gideon began to recognize as the cost of the marriage they had never truly had. On the 7th day of his search, frustrated and exhausted, Gideon stood in the churchyard of Thornwick and stared at the graves of people he had never known. The October wind carried the scent of turning leaves and approaching winter. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life continued, indifferent to his search, indifferent to his loss. "Begging your pardon, my lord." Gideon turned to find an elderly woman approaching, her gray hair tucked beneath a serviceable bonnet, her dress marking her as someone of modest but respectable means. She carried a basket of late-season flowers, clearly intended for one of the graves. "I am Harriet Wicklow," she said with a small curtsy. "I could not help but notice you have been searching most diligently these past days. For your wife, I believe." "You have information?" Gideon asked, hope flaring painfully in his chest. "Not information precisely," Harriet said carefully. "But I know someone who might. Prudence Hadley lives about 2 miles east of here in a cottage beyond Miller's Creek. She keeps to herself, does Prudence, since her husband passed 5 years ago. Doesn't come to market often, doesn't attend services regularly. If someone wished to avoid notice in these parts, they would scarce do better than to seek shelter with Prudence." Gideon's heart began to pound. "Why are you telling me this?" Harriet met his gaze steadily. "Because I have known Prudence Hadley for 40 years, and I know she has a kind heart for those in need. And because you have the look of a man who has lost something precious and only just realized its value. That combination seems worth a chance at redemption." 20 minutes later, Gideon stood before a small stone cottage set back from the road, smoke curling from its chimney into the gray sky. His hand hesitated before knocking, suddenly uncertain. What if Genevieve was here? What if she had sought shelter and chosen to remain hidden rather than send word to him? What did that say about their marriage? About him? He knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman perhaps 50 years of age, tall and sturdy, with shrewd blue eyes that assessed him in a single glance. "Lord Brackley, I presume?" she said without preamble. "Harriet sent word you might be calling. You had best come in." The cottage interior was modest, but meticulously clean, with herbs hanging from the rafters and a cheerful fire crackling in the hearth. And sitting in a wooden chair near that fire, wrapped in a quilt and reading a book, was Genevieve. She glanced up as he entered, and Gideon felt the world tilt. She was thinner than he remembered, with a fading bruise along her left temple and her arm supported by a clean linen sling. But she was alive, unmistakably, miraculously alive. A sudden violent wave of relief compelled him to grip the doorframe to remain standing. "Genevieve," he said, his voice breaking on her name. She tilted her head, studying him with polite confusion. "I am sorry, sir, but I fear you have me at a disadvantage. Do we know each other?" The words struck him like a physical blow. Gideon looked to Prudence Hadley, who nodded grimly. "She remembers nothing," Prudence said quietly. "Not her name, not where she came from, not anything before waking in my cottage a week ago. I found her wandering near the creek the morning after the great storm, covered in mud and blood, barely conscious. She has been here recovering since then." A week during which Genevieve had been alive, had been safe, and had forgotten everything, including him. Gideon moved into the room slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "My name is Gideon Marlowe Aldridge," he said carefully. "Earl of Brackley, and you, madam, are my wife. Genevieve Clara Aldridge, Countess of Brackley. We have been married for 3 years." He observed as Genevieve processed this information, her honey-colored eyes searching his face for some spark of recognition. He witnessed the moment hope faded, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like disappointment. "I am sorry," she said softly, her voice edged with a strange formality. "I remember nothing of marriage or of being a countess. Truly, I remember nothing at all before waking here in Prudence's care." Prudence moved to stand beside Genevieve's chair, her hand resting protectively on the younger woman's shoulder. "Perhaps, Lord Brackley, you might explain the circumstances that led your wife to be traveling alone through Yorkshire during a storm. For it seems to me that a husband who treasures his wife would not permit such a journey." The accusation in her tone was unmistakable, and Gideon found he had no defense. "You are correct," he said simply. "I have been a poor husband. The fault is entirely mine." Genevieve studied him with renewed interest. "You admit this freely?" "I admit it because it is true. I married you because duty demanded it, not because I loved you. I provided every material comfort, but offered no companionship, no affection, no genuine partnership. You were lonely in our marriage, and rather than address that loneliness, I retreated further into my work and my solitude. When you left for Yorkshire, I believe now it was not to visit relations, but to escape a situation that had become unbearable. The words tasted like ashes, but they were also liberation. For 3 years, he had hidden behind propriety and distance. Now, facing his wife, who could not remember him, he found himself speaking with an honesty he had never dared before. Genevieve's expression softened slightly. That must have been a difficult admission to make. It is merely truth. The difficulty lies in having taken so long to acknowledge it. Gideon paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I understand you remember nothing of our marriage, of our life together. I cannot force you to return to Brackley Manor, to resume a life you do not recall, but I would ask that you permit me to stay in Thornwick for a time, to prove through actions, not words, that I can be the husband I should have been from the beginning." Prudence's eyebrows rose, a clear sign of her intrigue. "You would stay in the village? A nobleman?" Her dry tone conveyed her doubt that such a sacrifice was sustainable. "I would sleep in the stable of the Shepherd's Rest if necessary. I am asking only for the opportunity to earn what I failed to appreciate when I had it." Gideon turned to Genevieve. "I am asking for the chance you cannot remember, but which I squandered nonetheless." Silence stretched through the cottage, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Genevieve looked up at Prudence, who squeezed her shoulder gently. "It is your choice, my dear," Prudence said. "But if you wish this man to prove his words, I would suggest we allow him the opportunity. Actions speak clearer than promises, and time will reveal whether his intentions are genuine." Genevieve returned her gaze to Gideon, and he saw the intelligence in her eyes, the careful assessment of a woman who might not remember her past, but had learned to trust her instincts about the present. "Very well," she said at last. "You may stay. But understand, Lord Brackley, I make no promises. I do not know you. I do not remember loving you, if indeed I ever did. You are asking me to trust a stranger who claims to be my husband, and that trust must be earned." "I understand," Gideon said, and meant it. "Thank you." As he prepared to leave the cottage and seek lodging at the inn, Genevieve called out softly, "Lord Brackley, what should I call you?" He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. "My name is Gideon, though you called me my lord in our previous life together. I would prefer, if you are willing, that you use my given name. It seems we are starting anew, and perhaps we might begin with less formality than we maintained before." A faint smile touched her lips. "Very well then, Gideon. I shall see you tomorrow." It was, he thought, as he stepped out into the October twilight, the first time she had ever smiled at him with genuine warmth. The irony was not lost on him that it had taken her losing all memory of him to achieve it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the fallen leaves. Gideon arrived at Prudence's cottage just after sunrise, dressed not in the fine clothes of an earl, but in simple working attire more suited to a country gentleman. He had spent half the night thinking about how to approach this situation, and had concluded that grand gestures and noble declarations would serve no purpose. Genevieve could not remember him, which meant she had no reason to trust him based on past affection. He would have to earn her regard through present action, through becoming someone worth knowing, rather than merely someone she had been obligated to tolerate. Prudence answered his knock, eyeing his attire with approval. "You look more sensible this morning, Lord Brackley. I see the prospect of genuine toil did not send you back to London after all. Come in then. Genevieve is just finishing her breakfast." Inside, He found his wife seated at the small table, her hair caught back in a simple braid, wearing a plain dress that Prudence must have loaned her. She looked younger somehow, unburdened, and Gideon felt a pang of guilt, recognizing that losing her memory of their marriage had somehow freed her mind. "Good morning," she said, her tone cautious but not unfriendly. "Prudence tells me you arrived at first light. That suggests either great dedication or poor sleeping habits." "Both, I suspect," Gideon admitted, accepting the cup of tea Prudence offered. "I am not accustomed to inaction, and this situation requires patience I have not traditionally possessed." "Honesty again," Genevieve observed. "Is this new for you, or was it always your way?" "It is new, or rather it is old, but long abandoned. War teaches you to guard your thoughts and feelings. I fear I never learned to lower those guards again, even when circumstance no longer required them." Prudence settled into her chair with her own tea. "So you are a veteran, Lord Brackley. That explains some of the distance you described in your marriage. My late husband served briefly in his youth, and he spoke of how battle changes a man's relationship with both death and emotion. Your husband was wise. I returned from the peninsula believing that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. I imposed that philosophy on our marriage without considering the cost to Genevieve." He met his wife's gaze directly. "I made you invisible in your own home, and I am more sorry for that than I can adequately express." Genevieve set down her teacup with careful precision. "These apologies, while appreciated, mean little without corresponding action. What do you propose to do here in Thornwick? How exactly does an Earl prove himself worthy of a second chance?" "By being useful," Gideon said simply. "Prudence, I noticed your woodpile is dangerously low and winter approaches. I would be grateful if you would permit me to remedy that situation this morning. And Genevieve, if you are well enough, I thought perhaps you might walk with me about the village, not as husband and wife, but as two people attempting to know each other. You could show me the places that have become familiar to you these past weeks." Prudence's expression softened with approval, while Genevieve looked surprised. "You would chop wood? An Earl? I am also a man with two functioning arms and a need to demonstrate that I am not merely decorative nobility. Besides, I suspect physical labor might serve as useful penance for 3 years of neglect." A flicker of amusement crossed Genevieve's face. "Very well, but if you injure yourself with the axe, do not expect sympathy from either of us. We have little patience for masculine bravado that ends in bloodshed." 3 hours later, Gideon had reduced Prudence's modest woodpile to a substantial stack that would see her through the winter, and his shoulders ached in a way that felt strangely satisfying. Physical labor had always helped quiet his mind, and today was no exception. As he worked, he had watched through the cottage window as Genevieve helped Prudence with household tasks, moving with easy comfort through a space that had become familiar to her. When he finished, she emerged wearing a warm cloak, and together they walked toward the village proper. The October sun had burned away the morning frost, and the air carried the earthy scent of autumn. "Tell me about Thornwick," Gideon said as they walked. "What have you learned of it during your time here?" "It is a small place, but kind," Genevieve replied, her hands folded inside her cloak. "The people mostly keep to themselves, but they have accepted my presence without excessive curiosity. Prudence told them I was a distant relation recovering from an accident, which seemed to satisfy everyone's questions." "And you have been content here? Even without knowing who you were?" She considered the question carefully. Content is perhaps too strong a word, but there is a certain sense of repose in the simplicity. Wake, work, eat, read, sleep. No obligations beyond the immediate, no expectations to fulfill. It has felt, I think, rather like being newly born into the world, everything fresh and uncomplicated. They reached the center of the village, where several locals were going about their morning business. An elderly man tipped his hat to Genevieve, who returned the greeting with easy familiarity. Gideon noted the exchange with interest. "That is Mr. Cornelius Ashford," Genevieve said, then paused. "Oh, but perhaps you already knew that. I forget that you are new to Thornwick, not I. Or rather, you are new and I am new, though for different reasons." "I know nothing of Thornwick or its inhabitants," Gideon assured her. "You have the advantage here." They continued walking, and Genevieve pointed out various landmarks and people. The blacksmith's forge, run by a jovial man named Wallace Cartwright, who had 3 daughters and a loud laugh. The bakery operated by Margaret Fletcher, who made the finest wheat bread Genevieve had ever tasted, or at least the finest she could remember tasting. The small school where a young woman named Eloise Sutton taught perhaps 15 children of various ages, all crammed into a single room. As they walked, Gideon observed not just the village, but Genevieve herself. Without the constraints of her former life, she seemed more animated, more present. She smiled easily at the villagers, showed genuine interest in their mundane concerns, moved through this simple world with a lightness he had never witnessed during their marriage. "You seem happy here," he said quietly. Genevieve glanced at him. "Is that disapproval I hear?" "No, observation, and perhaps regret that I never beheld you like this before. Happy, I mean. Or if you were, I was too absorbed in my own isolation to notice." They had reached the small church at the far end of the village, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Yorkshire seasons. Genevieve led him to a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its leaves brilliant gold in the autumn sunlight. "May I ask you something?" she said as they sat. "And will you answer with the same honesty you have shown thus far?" "You may ask anything. I will answer truthfully." "When you learned of the accident, when you believed I might be dead, what did you feel?" The question struck deep, but Gideon did not flinch from it. Terror and guilt. The terror was immediate and overwhelming. The guilt took longer to fully comprehend, but it was perhaps more painful. I realized, standing in our London drawing room, reading the report of your disappearance, that I had lost you long before any carriage accident. That I had systematically destroyed any chance of genuine connection between us through my own emotional cowardice. That is a harsh assessment of yourself. It is accurate. I used my war experiences as justification for keeping everyone at a distance, but in truth, I simply lacked the courage to be vulnerable, to risk caring and potentially being hurt. So I chose safety over connection, duty over love, and in doing so, I created a marriage that was a prison for you. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the gold and amber leaves of the oak tree. "I cannot remember that prison," she said finally, "but I believe you about its existence. There is something in the way you speak of our marriage that rings true, a kind of specific detail that cannot be invented. And I have noticed something these past weeks without memory." "What is that?" "That I do not miss being a countess. When you told me that was my role, my title, I felt no longing to return to it. Only a vague sense of lightness that I could not remember the weight of those obligations. That should tell you something about the life we lived together." "It tells me I failed you entirely," Gideon said. "And it raises a question I must ask, though I fear the answer. Do you wish to remember? Or would you prefer to remain as you are now, free of those memories?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Genevieve turned to look at him directly, and he met her gaze without flinching, though it cost him. "I do not know," she admitted. "Part of me is curious about who I was, what my life contained. But another part fears that remembering might destroy this peace I have found. Does that make me terribly selfish?" "It makes you human and honest. 2 qualities I value highly, having spent too long denying both in myself." They sat in silence for a while, the October sun warm on their faces, despite the chill in the air. In the distance, children's voices rose from the school, reciting some lesson in unison. A dog barked, a cart rattled past on the road. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life, and Gideon found himself treasuring them in a way he never had before. "Will you tell me about our life together?" Genevieve asked eventually. "Not to convince me to return, but simply so I might know who I was?" And so Gideon began to speak. He told her about their wedding 3 years prior, arranged by their families, as was common among their class. He described Brackley Manor in Derbyshire, its grand rooms and extensive grounds, the weight of history in every stone. He spoke of her love of reading, how she had spent hours in the library while he worked in his study, both of them alone in the same house. He admitted how he had taken meals in near silence, how he had treated their marriage as a duty fulfilled rather than a partnership. "You tried," he said, his voice rough with remembered shame. "That first year especially, you made overtures. You asked about my work, suggested activities we might enjoy together, attempted conversation during those endless silent dinners. And I rebuffed every attempt with polite disinterest, until you learned to stop asking. I watched you retreat into yourself, into books and solitude, and told myself that was simply how things were. That companionship was an unrealistic expectation." "Were we unkind to each other?" Genevieve asked. "No, never unkind. That might have been easier in some ways, because anger at least proves feeling. We were simply absent. Two people living parallel lives under the same roof, never quite intersecting. I cannot recall a single moment when I asked about your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. I knew nothing of your inner life because I never bothered to inquire. And yet now you speak of these failures with such clarity. What changed?" "Your absence, the possibility of your death. It has a way of sharpening one's perspective, realizing what one has lost through sheer neglect. And then finding you alive but unable to remember me forced a reckoning I might otherwise have avoided. You cannot return to me out of obligation or duty or even residual affection because you possess none of those ties. Any relationship we build now must be built on present choice, not past vows." Genevieve studied him with an intensity that made Gideon feel exposed, as if she could see through all his carefully constructed defenses to the damaged man beneath. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "I suppose I imagined an aristocrat demanding his property be returned, someone imperious and cold, insisting on rights and obligations. Instead, you chop wood and speak of your failures with unsettling honesty. It is rather disconcerting." A faint smile touched Gideon's lips. "I am capable of being imperious and cold. I spent 3 years perfecting those qualities. But they gained me nothing except a hollow marriage and a wife who fled rather than endure my company any longer. I have no desire to repeat those mistakes." "So what do you desire, truly?" The question deserved absolute honesty. Gideon turned to face her fully, abandoning pretense. "I desire to know you, not the Countess of Brackley fulfilling her obligations, but Genevieve as she actually is. I desire to understand what brings you joy, what causes you sorrow, what makes you laugh. I desire to build something real, even if it takes months or years. And if at the end of that time you choose not to return to Brackley Manor, I will accept that decision because at least I will have tried to do better." Genevieve's expression softened. "That is a great deal to ask of yourself." "It is what I should have asked from the beginning. I am simply 3 years late in the asking." They remained on the bench beneath the oak tree until the church bells chimed noon, talking of inconsequential things. Gideon told her about Yorkshire's history, about the wars he had survived, about his childhood before everything changed. Genevieve spoke of the books she had been reading at Prudence's cottage, the simple pleasures of village life, the peculiar freedom of not knowing who one was supposed to be. When they finally rose to return to Prudence's cottage, Gideon felt a tremor of promise that perhaps, despite everything, it was not too late to become the man he should have been all along. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Gideon stayed at the Shepherd's Rest, but spent his days in and around Thornwick, actively making himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with being an earl. He helped Wallace Cartwright at the forge, learning to shoe horses and mend broken tools. He assisted farmers with their harvest, his military fitness serving him well in physical labor. He read to the children at Eloise Sutton's school, discovering he had a talent for bringing historical accounts to life, and every day he spent time with Genevieve. Sometimes they walked together through the village or the surrounding countryside. Sometimes they sat in Prudence's cottage while she worked at her mending, and they simply talked. Slowly, carefully, they began to know each other in ways they never had during their marriage. Gideon learned that Genevieve had a dry wit that emerged when she felt safe enough to express it. That she loved autumn mornings best when frost painted the world silver. That she had a gift for hearing the troubles beneath what people said aloud, and often knew what was truly bothering someone before they spoke it themselves. That she hummed while working, unconscious melodies that suggested she had once been trained in music. Genevieve learned that Gideon's military bearing softened when he was genuinely engaged with something, that he had a talent for listening without judgment, a skill born from commanding men under impossible circumstances, that he carried guilt for every soldier he had lost, names and faces he would never forget, that beneath his controlled exterior lived someone who felt deeply but had long ago learned to hide it. 4 weeks into his stay in Thornwick, during a particularly cold November morning, they were walking along Miller's Creek when Genevieve suddenly stopped, her hand pressing to her temple. "Are you well?" Gideon asked immediately, moving quickly to her side. "I am not certain," she said slowly. "Something just flickered in my mind. Not quite a memory, but an impression. Of music. A pianoforte being played in a large room." Gideon's heart began to pound. "You played beautifully. The music room at Brackley Manor has a Broadwood grand pianoforte. You would practice every afternoon." Genevieve closed her eyes, clearly trying to grasp the elusive image. "I can almost see it. Green wallpaper, tall windows overlooking gardens. But then it is gone again." "Do not force it," Gideon said gently, though every instinct screamed at him to tell her more, to try to trigger further memories. "If your memory returns, it will do so in its own time." She opened her eyes, looking at him with something approaching frustration. "Are you not hoping I will remember? Would that not solve many of your problems?" "It would solve nothing if you remember only the emptiness I created. And yes, I hope you will regain your memories, but not because it serves my purposes, because they belong to you, and you deserve to have the full story of your life, pleasant or otherwise. Whatever you choose to do with that story afterward is your decision." They continued their walk in silence, but Gideon noticed Genevieve's hand occasionally rising to her temple as if trying to recapture that fleeting impression. It was the first suggestion that her memory might return, and with it came both hope and dread. If she remembered their marriage as it truly was, would she choose to give him the chance he sought? Or would those memories confirm that he had destroyed any possibility of redemption? That evening, as he sat alone in his room at the Shepherd's Rest, Gideon wrote a letter to his steward at Brackley Manor, instructing him to prepare the music room, to open the windows daily to air it out, to keep the pianoforte perfectly tuned, to place fresh flowers there each week. If Genevieve did return, he wanted that space to welcome her, not as a museum of their failed marriage, but as a place of possibility. The 5th week brought an unexpected complication in the form of Lord Edmund Fitzgerald, Viscount Ashton, who arrived in Thornwick with the presumption of old friendship and an apparent inability to read the room. Gideon was helping Wallace Cartwright repair a wagon wheel when the Viscount's elegant carriage rolled into the village square, attracting immediate attention from the locals. Edmund emerged wearing clothes far too fine for the country, his expression equal parts concern and curiosity. "Brackley," he called out, spotting Gideon in his work clothes. "Good Lord, man, what are you doing? I received word you had vanished north on some mad quest, and I find you dressed like a common laborer." Gideon straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. Edmund had been a fellow officer during the wars, one of the few men Gideon still considered a friend, though they had grown apart in recent years. His presence here was both unwelcome and oddly touching. "Ashton," Gideon acknowledged, "I am surprised to see you." "I should imagine so. When Henderson sent word that you had taken off after your missing wife and had not returned after nearly 2 months, I felt obligated to investigate. Are you quite well? You look rather more rustic than I recall." "I am perfectly well, and my wife is alive, which you might have learned before traveling all this way had you waited for my correspondence." Edmund's eyes widened. "Alive? But Henderson said the carriage was destroyed, the coachman dead." "She survived. Come, I shall explain, but perhaps in a more private setting." They adjourned to the Shepherd's Rest, where Gideon provided a carefully edited version of events. He explained the accident, Genevieve's memory loss, her recovery at Prudence's cottage. He did not mention the true state of their marriage or his reasons for staying in Thornwick, but Edmund was not a stupid man. "So you have been playing at village life while your countess recovers her memory," Edmund said slowly. "That seems rather more dedicated than the Brackley I knew. The man I served with would have sent physicians and servants to retrieve his wife, then returned to his duties. You are not usually given to such sustained personal involvement. The man you served with failed his wife for 3 years through exactly that kind of detachment. I am attempting to do better." Edmund studied him with new interest. "She does not remember you at all?" "Not a thing, which means she has no obligation to return to me, no duty beyond what she chooses. I am trying to earn what I should have valued from the beginning." "You are in love with her." The statement, delivered with Edmund's characteristic bluntness, struck Gideon silent. Was he in love with Genevieve? He had married her without love, had treated her as a duty for 3 years. But these past weeks, learning who she truly was beneath the role of countess, watching her smile and laugh and engage with the world around her, he had felt something shift in his chest. Something that felt dangerously like the emotion he had spent years avoiding. "I am learning to love her," he said finally, "which is different than being in love, perhaps. I am learning who she is, and finding that person remarkable in ways I was too blind to notice before. Whether that constitutes love, I cannot say. I only know I would very much like the opportunity to find out." Edmund leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Now this is unexpected. Brackley the Ice King, thawed by his own wife's oblivion. There is irony in that." "There is," Gideon agreed. "And Edmund, I would ask that you keep your visit brief. Your presence draws attention, and Genevieve has found peace here. I will not have that disturbed by gossip or speculation about her circumstances." "Understood. Though I should like to meet this woman who has accomplished what war, loss, and 3 years of marriage could not, making you feel something." Against his better judgment, Gideon agreed to bring Edmund to Prudence's cottage the following morning. He sent word ahead, giving Genevieve the choice of whether to receive them, and was somewhat surprised when she agreed. Prudence answered the door with a skeptical expression that only deepened when she saw Edmund's fine clothes. "Another lord," she said dryly. "We are positively overrun with nobility today." Inside, Genevieve stood by the fire, wearing one of her simple borrowed dresses, her hair in a neat braid. She looked at Edmund with polite interest, but none of the automatic deference one might expect for a Viscount. "Viscountess Brackley," Edmund said, bowing formally. "I am Lord Edmund Fitzgerald, Viscount Ashton. I served with your husband during the Peninsula campaign." "Please call me Genevieve," she said. "I find titles rather confusing, given that I cannot remember possessing one." "And you need not be so formal. Any friend of Gideon's is welcome here, provided you do not intend to drag him back to London immediately." Edmund's eyebrows rose, and he glanced at Gideon with undisguised interest. "I would not dream of interfering, though I confess curiosity about how you have been spending your time here." "Recovering," Genevieve said simply. and learning to know my husband, though that is perhaps the wrong term, since I have no memory of our marriage. We are more accurately two strangers attempting to determine if we might become friends." "Friends," Edmund repeated, testing the word. "An unusual goal for a married couple, but not without merit." He turned to Gideon. "You have not told her, then?" "Told me what?" Genevieve asked sharply. Gideon shot Edmund a warning look, but the damage was done. "That your families arranged the match, that you barely knew each other before the wedding. That, in essence, it was a practical arrangement." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Genevieve's expression had gone very still, and when she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Gideon told me our marriage was difficult. He did not specify that it was merely a matter of duty. Because the specific arrangements matter less than the result," Gideon said quietly. "Yes, our families arranged the match. Yes, we barely knew each other before the wedding. But those circumstances do not excuse my failure to build something genuine afterward. Many couples begin with arranged marriages and create real partnerships. I simply chose not to try." "Until now," Genevieve said. "Until now," Gideon agreed, "when I no longer have the luxury of your obligated presence." Edmund looked between them, clearly recognizing he had stepped into complicated territory. "I should perhaps take my leave," he said. "I merely wish to ensure Brackley had not lost his mind entirely, but I see he is exactly where he chooses to be. Genevieve, it was a pleasure meeting you, even under such unusual circumstances. Brackley, I trust you will return to civilization eventually, but I wish you well in this endeavor." After Edmund departed, the atmosphere in the cottage remained strained. Prudence, reading the situation with her usual perception, announced she needed to visit the market and left Genevieve and Gideon alone. "You have been remarkably honest with me," Genevieve said finally, still standing by the fire. "But you omitted the detail that our marriage was arranged. Why?" "Because I feared it would color your perception of me even more negatively than my own behavior already had. But Edmund is correct. You deserve to know the full context. Our families arranged the match when you were 23 and I was 28. We met 3 times before the wedding, always under supervision. I thought you pleasant, but unremarkable, and I suspect you found me cold and distant, which was accurate. We married because it was expected, because I needed an heir and you needed security. And then I proceeded to ignore you for 3 years. Did I try to reach you? In the beginning?" Gideon's throat tightened. "Yes. You tried for nearly a year, small gestures mostly, asking about my day, suggesting we might ride together or visit tenants, planning dinners with guests who might interest me. And I politely declined every attempt until you learned to stop asking. I watched you recede into yourself, into books and solitude, and told myself it was simply how things were. I was remarkably skilled at self-deception." Genevieve moved to the window, staring out at the November landscape. "Part of me wishes I could remember those attempts, that year of trying. It might help me understand who I was then." "You were the more courageous of us," Gideon said. "You at least tried to make something of what we had been given. I simply accepted emptiness as inevitable." She turned to face him. "If my memory returns and I remember all of that rejection, all of that loneliness, will you tell me I should forgive it simply because you have now decided to change?" "No, I will tell you that you have every right to your anger, your hurt, your refusal to give me another chance. What I hope is that you might see that I am genuinely trying to become someone different. Not to manipulate you into returning, but because I finally understand what I threw away through my own cowardice." They stood in silence for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Then Genevieve sighed, some of the stiffness leaving her shoulders. "I do not remember loving you," she said quietly. "But I am beginning to like you, which is perhaps more concerning. The man you describe from our marriage sounds unbearable. The man I have come to know these past weeks is thoughtful and honest and willing to question himself. I do not know which version is real." "Both are real," Gideon said. "I am capable of being the cold, distant man you married. These weeks have not erased that capacity. What I hope is that I'm also capable of choosing to be something better and sustaining that choice beyond the initial effort of winning you back. And if I never remember, if this is all I am now, a woman without a past, then we build from here. No history, no obligations, just two people choosing each day whether to continue building something together. It is what I should have done from the beginning." Genevieve smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." "It is not simple. It is probably the most difficult thing I have ever attempted, which includes 6 years of war. But it is also the most important." Prudence returned shortly after with bread and cheese from the market, and the tension eased into something more comfortable. They ate together, the conversation turning to lighter topics, but Gideon noticed how Genevieve occasionally grew distant, her hand rising to her temple as if chasing elusive memories. That night, as he lay in his room at the Shepherd's Rest, Gideon grappled with the fear that had been growing steadily. What if Genevieve's memories did return? What if she remembered not just the facts of their marriage, but the specific pain of his rejection, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small dismissals? He had apologized, yes, but apologies could not erase years of emotional neglect. They could not restore the time she had spent lonely and invisible in her own home. He had asked for a chance to prove himself changed, but change was easy when the circumstances were temporary, when he was playing at village life with no real responsibilities. What would happen when they returned to Brackley Manor, to the weight of the earldom, to all the pressures and obligations that had contributed to his withdrawal in the first place? Would he revert to his old patterns, or had these weeks genuinely transformed him? The questions haunted him into the small hours of the morning, but he had no answers, only the determination to keep trying, to keep showing Genevieve through actions that he could be someone worth choosing, even if she never chose him. He caught himself replying to a steward's query with genuine interest the following morning. The vigilance, he realized, was the penance, and the habit was slowly, thankfully, beginning to stick. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Gideon's arrival in Thornwick, on a cold December morning when snow had begun to fall in earnest. Genevieve had seemed troubled for several days, increasingly withdrawn as fragmentary memories continued to surface. She spoke less, smiled rarely, and spent long hours staring into the fire as if trying to see something just beyond her reach. Gideon was helping Prudence carry in firewood when they heard a sharp cry from inside the cottage. They rushed in to find Genevieve on the floor, hands pressed to her head, tears streaming down her face. "It is coming back," she gasped. "All of it. The memories. They are all rushing back at once." Gideon knelt beside her, careful not to touch her without permission. "What do you remember?" "Everything." The word was half sob, half accusation. "The wedding where you looked at me with such cold assessment. The first year when I tried so desperately to reach you. The gradual realization that you felt nothing for me, that I was simply a duty you had fulfilled. The loneliness, Gideon. The terrible, suffocating loneliness of being married to someone who could not be bothered to know me." Each word landed like a blow, and Gideon absorbed them without defense. "I know. I am so sorry." "Sorry." Genevieve looked at him with eyes full of pain. "You apologize now, after 6 weeks of playing at being a better man. But I remember the real you, Gideon. The man who spent 3 years making me feel invisible. Who sat across from me at dinner night after night without once asking about my thoughts or my day. Who walked past me in our own home as if I were furniture. And now you think a few weeks of chopping wood and taking walks makes up for that." "No," Gideon said steadily, though his heart was breaking. "No amount of apology or changed behavior can undo those 3 years. I know that. But I am not trying to erase the past, Genevieve. I am trying to prove that the future can be different." She laughed bitterly. "The future. I remember why I left London, you know. I remember sitting in our drawing room, watching you read your newspaper, and realizing that I had disappeared into my own life. That I could probably walk out the door and you would not notice for days. So I decided to visit my aunt in Yorkshire, except she had died 6 months prior, and I simply needed an excuse to escape. I was running from you, Gideon, from the emptiness you had made of our marriage." "I know," he said quietly. "I knew it even before I found you here. That note you left, it was not about visiting relations. It was about fleeing a life that had become unbearable." Prudence had backed away to give them privacy, but Gideon could feel her watchful presence nearby. Genevieve remained on the floor, her body shaking with the force of recovered memories. "These past 6 weeks," she said, her voice breaking, "I have been falling in love with you. With the man you presented yourself as, the one who listened and cared and made me feel seen. But that man is a lie, is he not? Because I remember the real you, and he is nothing like this." "Both men are real," Gideon insisted. "I am capable of being the cold, dismissive husband you remember. But I am also capable of being the man you have come to know these past weeks. The question is, which version I choose to be going forward? And how can I possibly trust that choice? How do I know you will not revert the moment we return to Brackley Manor, the moment the novelty of winning me back wears off?" It was the question Gideon had been asking himself for weeks, and he had no certain answer, only belief, or perhaps desperate hope, that he had changed in ways that could not be easily undone. "You cannot know," he admitted. "I cannot offer you guarantees or certainties. All I can tell you is that losing you, believing you dead, and then finding you alive but with no memory of me, forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding for years. That I used my war trauma as justification for emotional cowardice. That I destroyed something precious through simple neglect. That I am capable of feeling deeply but had chosen numbness because it felt safer." "That is not enough," Genevieve whispered. "It is not enough to say you were broken by war and I should forgive everything because of it. I am not asking you to forgive me. I choose to release the anger, not for your sake, but for my own freedom. I am asking you to let me prove, through sustained action over time, that I can be different. And if you choose not to give me that chance, I will accept your decision. But please, Genevieve, do not let my failures steal the person you have been these past weeks. The woman who smiled easily and engaged with the world around her and allowed herself to be happy. You deserve to keep that freedom, regardless of whether you keep me." She looked up at him then, and he saw in her eyes the full weight of 3 years of neglect colliding with 6 weeks of connection. The pain of remembering combined with the fear that what she had found might be temporary. It was, he realized, the moment of truth. Whatever she decided now would determine the rest of both their lives. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think, to reconcile the man I remember with the man I have come to know. Can you give me that?" "As much time as you need. I will stay in Thornwick or return to London, whichever you prefer." "Stay," she said quietly, "but give me space. I cannot be near you right now, not when every glance reminds me of both who you were and who you pretend to be." Gideon nodded, rising slowly. "I understand. Prudence has my direction at the inn if you need me." As he moved toward the door, Genevieve called out, "Gideon, those weeks before the accident, when I was planning to leave, did you know? Did you notice I was pulling away?" He paused, forcing himself to answer truthfully. "No, I noticed nothing. I was so absorbed in my own routine, my own isolation, that I was blind to your suffering. That is perhaps my greatest shame, that I could share a home with you and remain completely unaware of your pain. At least you are honest now. It is the least I can offer. Truth, and the hope that I might someday deserve forgiveness, even if I never receive it." The following days were among the longest of Gideon's life. He remained in Thornwick, staying at the Shepherd's Rest, helping villagers with winter preparations, but he did not approach Prudence's cottage. He honored Genevieve's request for space, though it cost him dearly. Every morning he woke wondering if this would be the day she sent word, either asking him to leave or granting him another chance. And every evening he slept without hearing from her, the uncertainty gnawing at his resolve. He wrote letters to his steward, putting affairs in order in case he needed to remain in Yorkshire indefinitely. He wrote to Edmund, explaining what had transpired. He wrote to no one else, having no other relationships sufficiently close to warrant such confidence. On the 5th day of waiting, Harriet Wicklow found him at the blacksmith's forge, where he was helping Wallace Cartwright repair iron gates damaged by early winter storms. "Lord Brackley," she said, her expression kind but grave. "A word, if I might." They stepped outside into the December cold. Snow fell gently, muffling sound, creating the impression of a world suspended in waiting. "I have spoken with Prudence," Harriet said without preamble, "and she has told me something of your situation. I do not presume to judge, but I feel obligated to share an observation if you will permit an old woman's meddling. Please speak freely." Genevieve has been deeply shaken by the return of her memories. She wanders Prudence's cottage at night, unable to sleep. She weeps when she thinks no one can hear. But she also speaks of you, Lord Brackley, of the man you have been these past weeks. And she is torn, you see, between the pain of what was and the hope of what might be. Gideon's chest tightened. "I would spare her that pain if I could." "You cannot. The pain exists regardless of your presence. What you can do is continue to prove, through patient consistency, that your change is genuine. Do not press her for a decision. Do not demand her time or attention. Simply continue being the man you have been, and trust that she will find her way to whatever conclusion she must reach. And if that conclusion is to remain here, free of me and our marriage?" Harriet smiled sadly. "Then you will have given her the greatest gift possible, the freedom to choose her own path. But I do not believe that will be her choice. I have watched her these past weeks, watched how she softens when speaking of you, how she struggles now to reconcile two versions of the same man. That struggle suggests she still sees possibility in you, even through her pain." The words offered hope, fragile but real. Gideon nodded his thanks, and Harriet departed, leaving him standing in the snow. 7 days after their confrontation, Genevieve finally sent word. The message, delivered by a village boy, was brief. "Come to the cottage this afternoon. We need to talk." Gideon arrived precisely at the requested time, his heart pounding with a fear he had not experienced even in battle. At least in war, death was the worst outcome. Here, he faced something potentially more painful: the loss of possibility, the confirmation that he had destroyed beyond repair what he most wanted to preserve. Prudence opened the door, her expression unreadable. "She is in the sitting room. I shall be in the kitchen if needed, but I suspect you two need privacy for this conversation." Inside, Genevieve sat by the fire, wearing a dress Gideon recognized as one he had commissioned for her during their first year of marriage. She had never worn it at Brackley Manor, finding it too fine for everyday use. Seeing it now felt significant, though he could not determine whether that significance was positive or ominous. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from her. Gideon sat, forcing himself to remain still, to let her lead this conversation at her own pace. "I have spent the past week," Genevieve began, "attempting to reconcile two seemingly incompatible truths. The first truth is that you were a terrible husband for 3 years. You made me invisible in my own home, rejected every attempt I made at connection, and created a marriage that was emotionally barren. That truth is undeniable, and the pain of remembering it has been considerable." Gideon nodded, accepting the assessment without defense. "The second truth," she continued, is that you have been genuinely different these past 6 weeks. You have listened when I spoke, shown interest in my thoughts, made yourself vulnerable in ways the man I remember never did. You have worked beside villagers without concern for status, chopped wood and mended fences and read to children, all without apparent expectation of reward. That behavior is also undeniable. Both truths are real, Gideon said quietly. Yes, and therein lies my struggle. How do I trust that the second truth will outlast the novelty of this situation? How do I know you will not revert to the first truth the moment we return to normal life? You cannot know. I wish I could offer certainty, but I cannot. All I can say is that I have had time to examine myself quite thoroughly these past weeks, to understand the mechanisms by which I shut down emotionally after the wars. And I have learned that numbness is a choice I make repeatedly, not an inevitable state. Choosing differently requires constant vigilance, constant recommitment to being present rather than absent. But it is a choice I can make. Genevieve looked into the fire, her profile illuminated by the flickering light. I have made a decision, she said finally. Several decisions, in fact. Gideon's breath caught, but he remained silent, waiting. First, I have decided to forgive you. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger and hurt serves no purpose except to poison my own future. You failed me terribly, and that failure caused real damage. But I choose to release it, not for your sake, but for mine. Relief flooded through Gideon, though he knew forgiveness was only the beginning. Second, I have decided to return to Brackley Manor with you, but on conditions that are non-negotiable. Name them. I will not return to the marriage we had before. I will not accept silences and distance and being treated as a duty. If we do this, if we attempt to rebuild what should have been built 3 years ago, it will be as genuine partners. You will share your thoughts with me, your fears and hopes and struggles. You will allow me into your life, not as decoration, but as active participant. And if you find yourself retreating into old patterns, you will acknowledge it and recommit to doing better. I accept all your terms without reservation, Gideon said immediately. I am not finished. Third, Prudence comes with us. She has become dear to me, and I will not leave her here alone. She will serve as my companion and, to be frank, as a witness to whether you keep your promises. She will have her own quarters, her own independence, but she remains part of my household. Done. I will have rooms prepared immediately. Fourth, and finally, we begin again. Not as the Earl and Countess of Brackley fulfilling obligations, but as Gideon and Genevieve learning to build something real. I make no promises about love because I am not certain love can be rebuilt after such neglect. But I am willing to try for partnership, for friendship, for mutual respect and genuine affection. If love comes from that, well and good. If not, we will at least have created something better than what existed before. Gideon leaned forward, allowing himself to hope. I accept every condition. And Genevieve, I need you to understand something. These past weeks have been revelatory for me in ways that go beyond simply trying to win you back. I have learned that I am capable of connection, of caring, of being present in ways I believed were lost to me. You gave me that gift, even unknowingly. Whatever happens between us, I am grateful for it. She met his gaze fully for the first time since his arrival. I want to believe you have changed. Part of me does believe it, but I am also terrified that I am making a terrible mistake, that I am setting myself up for the same pain all over again. Your fear is reasonable and justified. I can only promise that I will do everything in my power to prove it unfounded. And if I fail, if I revert despite my best intentions, I will not fight you should you choose to leave again. You will always have that option, Genevieve. Always. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of decisions made and futures uncertain hanging between them. Then Genevieve stood, and Gideon rose with her. When do we leave? She asked. Whenever you are ready. I shall send word to have Brackley Manor prepared, "But there is no urgency. We can remain here through Christmas if you prefer." "No," she said firmly. "If we are to do this, let us begin now. Delay serves no purpose except to allow doubt to fester. We return to Derbyshire and we begin the difficult work of building a real marriage. Then we shall leave within the week." Genevieve nodded, then surprised him by stepping forward and resting her hand upon his forearm. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact since her memories returned, and Gideon felt the gesture acutely. "I want this to work," she said quietly. "I want to believe that people can change, that marriages can be healed, that second chances mean something. Do not make me regret that hope, Gideon." "I will spend the rest of my life proving it was not misplaced," he promised. The journey to Brackley Manor took 3 days through winter weather, with Gideon, Genevieve, and Prudence traveling in a comfortable carriage he had commissioned from London. Prudence proved an excellent companion, her dry wit and practical wisdom easing the tension that occasionally arose between husband and wife. As they traveled, Gideon pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the region. Genevieve listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes falling into silence as she processed the strangeness of returning to a life she remembered but had also left behind. She spoke occasionally of her time in Thornwick, of the peace she had found there, and Gideon vowed silently to ensure she found similar peace at Brackley Manor. They arrived at the estate on a cold December afternoon, sunlight breaking through clouds to illuminate the gray stone facade of the manor house. It was a beautiful building, Gideon acknowledged, its imposing silhouette hinting at the formality that had fostered her loneliness. The staff had assembled to greet their mistress's return, and Gideon watched carefully as Genevieve greeted each servant by name, surprising several who had not expected to be remembered. She moved through the entry hall with careful composure, her gaze taking in details that were both familiar and strange. "The green drawing room has been prepared as you requested, my lord," Henderson said quietly, "along with additional quarters for Mrs. Hadley." "Thank you, Henderson. Please ensure Mrs. Hadley has everything she requires, and inform the staff that the Countess and I are not to be disturbed this evening unless absolutely necessary." As the servants dispersed to their duties and Prudence was shown to her rooms, Gideon offered his arm to Genevieve. "May I show you what I have done?" She took his arm, and he led her through the familiar corridors toward the music room. He had sent detailed instructions ahead, and as they entered, he watched her face carefully for her reaction. The room had been transformed. Where before it had been formal and cold, it now felt warm and welcoming. The green wallpaper remained, but the heavy drapes had been replaced with lighter ones that allowed more natural light. Fresh flowers sat on the pianoforte, which gleamed from recent tuning. Comfortable chairs had been arranged near the fire with books and sheet music readily accessible. Most significantly, a large portrait that had dominated one wall, showing 3 generations of disapproving Aldridge ancestors, had been removed and replaced with landscape paintings of softer, more peaceful scenes. "The music room," Genevieve said softly. "You remembered? You said it was one of your first returning memories. I wanted it to welcome you home, not as a museum of what was, but as a space for what might be. If you hate it, we can change everything." She walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing over the pianoforte keys, producing a soft cascade of notes. "It is beautiful, different from how I remember it, but better, less formal." That was the intent. "I have given similar instructions for the rest of the house. Nothing will be as it was, Genevieve. We are building something new, remember? That includes our living space." She turned to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "You are trying so hard. I am trying to deserve you. It is not the same as succeeding, but I hope it counts for something." Over the following weeks, they established new patterns. Gideon kept his promise of genuine partnership, consulting Genevieve on estate matters, sharing his correspondence, asking her opinion on decisions large and small. They took meals together, actually conversing rather than sitting in painful silence. They walked the grounds daily when weather permitted, and read together in the evening by the fire. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something neither had experienced before, a real marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was not always easy. Sometimes Gideon felt himself retreating into old habits of silence and distance, and had to consciously choose to remain present. Sometimes Genevieve remembered specific moments of neglect from their previous life together, and the pain of those memories would create distance between them. But each time they talked about it, they did not allow wounds to fester or misunderstandings to grow. They chose to fight fairly, to apologize genuinely, to forgive quickly. Prudence watched over both of them with the shrewd affection of someone who had seen much of life and remained optimistic despite it. She gently called out Gideon when he seemed to be withdrawing and supported Genevieve when memories became overwhelming. Her presence served as both witness and gentle accountability. 3 months after their return to Brackley Manor, on a cold March evening, Genevieve found Gideon in his study, bent over his accounts beneath the focused gleam of the lamp. "May I interrupt?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up immediately, setting aside his pen. "Always." "You need never ask permission to interrupt me." She entered, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to tell you something I have been observing these past months." "Go on." "You have kept your promises, every one of them. When I see you starting to retreat, you catch yourself. When I express concern or hurt, you listen without defensiveness. When Prudence challenges you, you accept the criticism with grace. You are consistently daily choosing to be present in ways you never did before." "I am trying," Gideon said simply. "It is harder than I anticipated, choosing vulnerability over safety, but also more rewarding. I know. I can see how much effort it costs you, and I wanted you to know that I notice, that I value it." She paused, her gaze fixed on his, then stepped closer. "I also wanted to tell you that I think I am falling in love with you. Not remembering love that existed before, because I am not certain it ever did, but building love now, based on who we are becoming together." Gideon ascended from his chair, moving to stand before her. "I love you, not as duty or obligation, but as genuine, aching, terrifying emotion. I love who you are, who you have always been beneath the role I forced you into. And I am grateful beyond measure that you gave me the chance to learn to love you properly." She smiled, and it was the smile he remembered from Thornwick, warm, unguarded, real. "Then shall we continue building? See what else we might create together? I can think of nothing I would rather do." She leaned forward, and he met her halfway, their kiss tentative at first, but deepening into something that felt like promise, like hope, like the beginning they should have had 3 years prior, but had finally, against all odds, managed to create. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their shared room, a space Genevieve had only recently felt comfortable occupying again, she spoke into the silence. "Do you know what I think about sometimes? About that accident? About losing my memory?" "What do you think?" Gideon asked, his arm wrapped around her. "That perhaps it was necessary. That perhaps we needed that complete erasure, that blank page, to have any hope of building something real. If I had simply left and you had simply followed, we would have carried all that history, all those patterns, into any reconciliation. But the amnesia forced us to start completely over, to meet as strangers and choose each other freely rather than out of obligation. You think Providence intervened? I think accidents sometimes create opportunities, and we were fortunate enough, or brave enough, to seize ours." Gideon tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I am grateful for many things. For your survival, for your forgiveness, for your willingness to try again. But most of all, I am grateful that you taught me how to be present, how to feel, how to love. Even if you had ultimately chosen not to keep me, that lesson alone would have been worth everything. Fortunately, you are stuck with me now, for better or worse, as the vows say." For better, Gideon said firmly. It will be for better from this point forward. I swear it. And in the darkness of Brackley Manor, surrounded by the possibility of their future, both of them believed it. 3 years later, the music room at Brackley Manor had become the heart of the house. Where once it had been formal and rarely used, it now served as gathering space for family and friends, filled with laughter and life. Genevieve sat at the pianoforte, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease, while their daughter of 18 months, Margaret Eleanor, played on a blanket nearby with blocks Gideon had carved himself. A son, barely 3 months old, and named Thomas in honor of their faithful coachman, slept peacefully in a cradle near the fire. Prudence occupied her favorite chair, working on embroidery while keeping a watchful eye on both children. She had become indispensable to the household, not merely as companion, but as beloved family member. Your playing improves each week, Gideon observed from the doorway, where he had been watching unnoticed. Genevieve looked up with the easy smile that had become her habit. You are home early. I thought you were meeting with your solicitors about the Veterans Hospital. We finished ahead of schedule. The funding is secured. Construction begins in spring. Gideon entered the room, bending to kiss her temple before settling on the bench beside her. I thought we might take advantage of this rare afternoon at home. Should I make myself scarce? Prudence asked with knowing amusement. Absolutely not, Genevieve said firmly. You are family, Prudence, not a servant to be dismissed when inconvenient. Besides, one of us needs to actually watch the children while Gideon and I pretend to be responsible adults. They had developed this easy rhythm over 3 years of genuine partnership. Gideon involved Genevieve in all decisions regarding the estate, from agricultural improvements to charity work to political concerns. She had proven herself remarkably skilled at identifying problems and proposing solutions, skills that had gone completely unused during their first marriage. Together, they had transformed Brackley Manor from a cold monument to family history into a warm home. They entertained regularly, hosting dinners that featured genuine conversation rather than stiff formality. They supported local families in need, particularly veterans struggling with wounds physical and mental. They raised their children with hands-on involvement rather than delegating entirely to nurses and governesses. Most importantly, they had maintained the vulnerability and communication that had rebuilt their marriage. When Gideon felt himself withdrawing, he said so rather than allowing distance to grow. When Genevieve felt hurt or neglected, she expressed it immediately rather than letting resentment fester. They had learned to fight fairly, to apologize genuinely, to forgive quickly. I received a letter from Edmund today, Gideon said, reaching into his jacket. He is amazed by our transformation, though he expresses it with his usual bluntness. What does he say? Gideon read aloud, Brackley, I visited 3 times this past year, and each time you have become more human and less statue. Your wife clearly performs miracles. I am delighted for you, yet vexed that it took a carriage accident and amnesia to accomplish what 6 years of friendship could not. Nevertheless, I shall continue to visit and benefit from Genevieve's excellent hospitality, since your company has finally become tolerable. Yours in wonder, Ashton. Genevieve laughed. He does have a gift for backhanded compliments. He is not wrong, though. You did perform something miraculous. You took a man who was essentially dead inside and taught him to feel again, to live again. We taught each other, Genevieve corrected gently. You learned to be vulnerable, yes. But I learned that I deserve partnership, that I need not accept neglect as inevitable. We both grew. Margaret toddled over, demanding attention with the imperious nature of small children. Gideon scooped her up, settling her on his lap, while Genevieve continued playing softly. Do you ever regret it? Gideon asked quietly, watching their daughter. Giving me that second chance? Returning here rather than remaining free in Thornwick? Genevieve's hand stilled on the keys. She turned to face him fully, her honey-colored eyes serious. Never, not once. Do I remember the pain of our first marriage? Yes. Do those memories sometimes resurface and cause hurt? Also yes. But what we have built since then, this partnership we have created, it is worth every difficult moment. We earned this, Gideon. Both of us. I love you, he said, the words still carrying weight even after 3 years of saying them regularly. I will never stop being grateful that you survived that accident, that you gave me the chance I did not deserve, that you helped me become someone worth loving. I love you too. And for what it is worth, I think that accident was the best thing that could have happened to us. Not because I enjoyed losing my memory or nearly dying, but because it gave us the reset we needed. It forced us to build from nothing rather than trying to repair what was irreparably broken. Prudence looked up from her embroidery, her expression fond. You two are sickeningly sweet, you know. Who would have thought that the cold, distant Earl and his neglected wife would transform into the very picture of domestic happiness? It is rather nauseating, is it not? Genevieve agreed cheerfully. We should probably be more miserable to make others feel better. Please do not, Prudence said dryly. I have grown accustomed to being surrounded by people who actually like each other. It would be terribly disappointing to return to the old atmosphere of polite misery. As evening fell, they moved to the dining room for supper, then to the library for reading and conversation. These ordinary domestic moments, Gideon reflected, were the ones he treasured most. Not grand events or social triumphs, but simple evenings spent with his family, engaged and present and grateful. Later, after the children were settled and Prudence had retired to her rooms, Gideon and Genevieve stood together at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the moonlit grounds of Brackley Manor. Do you know what I think about sometimes? Genevieve said, echoing a conversation from 3 years prior. What do you think? That somewhere in Thornwick there is an oak tree where we sat and talked about second chances. And I hope that tree is still standing, still sheltering people who need a moment of peace and possibility. Because that is where we truly began, Gideon. Not at our wedding 3 years before that, but on that bench beneath autumn gold leaves when we decided to build something new. We should return someday, Gideon suggested. Show the children where their mother recovered and where their father learned to be human again, and then thank the people who made this second chance possible. I would like that, and I think Prudence would as well. She misses Thornwick sometimes, though she would never admit it. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had learned through great difficulty to choose each other, to build partnership from wreckage, to transform obligation into genuine love. Thank you, Gideon said finally. For what? For surviving, for forgiving me, for teaching me that it is never too late to become who you should have been all along, for giving our children the family I never had, for making this house into a home, for everything. Genevieve leaned into his embrace. Thank you for crossing England to find me, for staying in Thornwick when you could have demanded I return, for chopping wood, mending fences, and reading to children, for keeping your promises every single day, even when it is difficult, for being present. For better, Gideon murmured. For better, Genevieve agreed. And in the moonlit bedroom of Brackley Manor, 3 years and a lifetime away from the cold, silent marriage they had first created, the Earl and Countess of Brackley held each other close and understood that they had been given the rarest of gifts, a true second chance, and the wisdom to make it count. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story of second chances and redemptive love touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps me continue creating stories of love, resilience, and the belief that it is never too late to become who we were meant to be.